Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into a huge contradiction at the very heart of colonial America. How the idea of liberty absolutely exploded at the exact same time the brutal institution of slavery was becoming more and more powerful.
And to really get our heads around this, let's start with the story of one man, Oladua Equiano. His life is just the perfect example of this contradiction, and as you can see from his own words, he knew just how remarkable his own story was.
Just look at this journey. He was a free kid in West Africa, kidnapped at 11 and thrown into the horrors of slavery. And yet somehow, through this unbelievable series of events, he ends up buying his own freedom and becoming one of the loudest, most powerful voices against the very system that tried to crush him. His personal story really gives us a window into this massive global phenomenon.
So Equiano's story, it's all happening inside this massive British Empire that's kind of struggling with its own identity. And that brings us right to the core puzzle of this whole era.
So, here's the big question, right? How could an empire that was always talking about freedom and the rights of its people also be the #1 slave trader on the planet? It just doesn't seem to add up. Let's try and break down this paradox.
You really had these two realities existing at the same time, like two sides of the same coin. On one hand, colonists in America were super proud to be British. They loved the idea of British liberty and laws. But on the other hand, the empire they belonged to was built on the slave trade. And we're not talking about it being a small part of the economy. Slavery existed in every single colony.
You see, this wasn't just some philosophical disagreement. It was a machine, a powerful economic engine. And for a lot of people, this paradox wasn't a bug in the system, it was the system. And it was fueling incredible growth for the empire.
The scale is it's hard to wrap your head around. Just look at this number. Almost 4 million people forcibly moved across the ocean. And get this, that's just in the 1700s. That single century accounts for half of the total number of people taken over the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade. This wasn't a side business, it was a massive part of global commerce.
And this created a truly tragic, vicious cycle back in Africa. European traders would show up offering goods, but especially guns. Now, if you're an African ruler, you need those guns to defend your kingdom from your rivals. But what's the price for those guns? People. This demand for captives fueled more and more wars and raids, creating this terrible, destabilizing loop. It was absolutely devastating. And the journey itself, the infamous Middle Passage, well, it was a calculated horror show designed for profit. Can you even imagine? The space between decks, where human beings were chained for weeks, was sometimes only 1.5 feet high. People were packed in as tightly as possible, because, to the traders, they were just cargo.
So, with conditions like that, you can probably guess what happened. The death toll was just staggering. Diseases like smallpox and measles spread like wildfire. We estimate that 1 out of every 5 people, 20%, died on that voyage. They never even saw the Americas.
And this is a really important piece of the puzzle, something people often forget. While we're focused on North America, the vast majority of enslaved Africans, we're talking 95%, were sent to the sugar plantations of Brazil and the West Indies. The conditions there were so brutal and the death rate so high that they had this constant, insatiable demand for more people.
Okay, so let's zoom in on that smaller piece of the pie, mainland North America. Because even within that 5%, slavery wasn't just one single thing. It looked very different depending on where you were. You really had 3 distinct slave systems that developed.
All right, first up, the Chesapeake. Think Virginia and Maryland. This was the biggest and the oldest of the 3 systems, and it was all built on one cash crop, tobacco. By 1770, it was huge. Nearly half the entire population in that region was enslaved.
Life here for most enslaved people was defined by the tobacco fields, working under what's called a gang system. That means constant, brutal supervision from sunup to sundown. This whole setup created an incredibly powerful and wealthy class of planters. And of course, they used the law to lock in that power. They kept passing new laws that stripped away rights from all black people, whether they were free or enslaved. For example, a 1723 law took away the right to vote even from free black men who owned their own property. Just like that.
Now let's head south to our second system, the Rice Kingdom of South Carolina and Georgia. This place was unique. It was the only colony on the mainland where black people were actually the majority of the population. By the 1730s, 2/3 of the people living in South Carolina were black. Just let that sink in. Here, the whole economy was built on rice and indigo. And here's the wild irony.
The English colonists had no clue how to grow rice. They were taught by the enslaved West Africans, whose agricultural genius made the whole thing possible. The labor system here was also different, called the task system. You'd be assigned a specific amount of work for the day, and if you finished, your time was, in theory, your own. Now, this system created the single wealthiest group of slave owners in all of North America. It was so profitable that even Georgia, which was founded as a slavery-free utopia, quickly flipped and copied South Carolina's model. Okay, so for our third and final system, we head north. Now, slavery wasn't the absolute center of the northern economy like it was in the South, but, and this is a big but, it was still a really significant part of life, especially in the cities. In New York City, for instance, 1 out of every 5 people was enslaved. In the North, you didn't really have these massive plantations. Enslaved people worked a huge variety of jobs, on small farms, as skilled craftspeople, in homes as servants, and while their lives were still brutal, the legal framework was different. Some northern laws actually recognized slave marriages, or allowed an enslaved person to own property or even testify against a white person in court. These were things that were just unimaginable in the South. And there was another huge shift happening, the economy. In cities like Philadelphia, employers were starting to realize that it was often cheaper and more efficient to just pay someone a wage.
So, when you lay it all out side by side, the differences really pop. The main crop, the type of work, the legal rights, it all changed dramatically depending on where you were. So yes, slavery was everywhere, but the day-to-day reality of it could be worlds apart in Virginia, South Carolina, or New York.
But here's the thing. No matter how different these systems were, they all accomplished one thing. They created and legally enforced a new social hierarchy, a new ladder, based on this new and powerful idea of race. And the people writing the laws weren't shy about it. Just read this quote from a Virginia law from 1723. It says a distinction should be made, that people of African descent could never be accounted equal. It's right there in black and white. This wasn't some accidental byproduct. It was the whole point. They were building racial inequality directly into the legal code.
And this gets us right back to that paradox we started with. For many white colonists, their own freedom became defined by their power and their right to enslave other people. The expansion of liberty for some was happening because of the bondage of others. The very idea of white became linked with free and black with slave.
And that leaves us with a pretty heavy question, one that echoes from the colonial era all the way to today. When a nation's idea of liberty is built on the bondage of other people, who truly gets to define what freedom means, and who gets to be included in that promise? All right, let's get right into it. We talk a lot about the system of slavery, but what about the people caught within it? Today we're going to explore how a huge, diverse group of captive Africans, people from all these different cultures, managed to build a new world for themselves and fight back right in the middle of colonial America. And that's really the question, isn't it? Imagine everything you've ever known is just gone. How on earth do you start over? How do you build a community, a culture, a reason to keep going? This is the question enslaved people had to answer every single day. So let's really set the stage here. The first, and maybe the biggest challenge, was just being completely torn from their world. People arrived here not as some unified group, but as individuals, scattered and facing a reality that is just unimaginable. And this is so important to get. This wasn't one people, not even close. They were Igbo, Ashanti, Yoruba, you name it. They came from all these distinct, rich cultures, spoke different languages, had different religions. The old ways you knew who your people were, all of that was gone.
And that's where everything changed. The thing that finally brought them together wasn't some shared history from back home. No, it was their shared, brutal present. The experience of slavery itself became the very thing that forged a new, shared identity.
So, how did they deal with this shared fate? Well, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about creating. This is the story of an incredible, active, and creative response to a world trying to crush them. Okay, here's a key term we need to know. Creole. That refers to people born into slavery in the Americas. But here's the twist. In the 1700s, there was this massive, constant influx of newly captured Africans. So what you get is this re-Africanization, which kept those African traditions alive and super vibrant. Which means the culture they built wasn't just a copy and paste of life in Africa. It was a living, breathing synthesis,
a powerful mix of their African roots, bits and pieces of European culture they encountered, and the brand new, harsh conditions they faced right here in America.
And you can see this blend so clearly in their spiritual lives. In many West African religions, there's no hard line between the spiritual world and the everyday world. So in America, many enslaved people found these amazing ways to weave their traditional beliefs together with the Protestantism they were exposed to, creating something totally unique and resilient.
But here's the thing, this story didn't play out the same way everywhere. Not even close. The experience of slavery was dramatically different depending on the region, and it basically created three distinct worlds.
I mean, the differences are just striking. Take the Chesapeake, Virginia and Maryland. There you had constant contact with whites, which led to communities that were more family-centered, but also more assimilated. But then you go further south to the Carolinas and Georgia. Whoa, it's a completely different story.
On those huge, brutal rice plantations in the Low Country, there was actually less day-to-day contact with whites, and that little bit of space, it allowed for something incredible to grow. They built homes in an African style, they spoke Gullah, a unique language blending African words and English, and they gave their children African names. It was a world of their own.
You know, just creating and holding onto a culture is a profound act of resistance. It's a shield against being dehumanized. But that brings up a pretty powerful question. If culture was their shield, what was their sword?
Because they weren't just surviving, they were fighting back. This was never a story about passive acceptance. It's a story of constant, relentless defiance and the fight for actual physical freedom. And this resistance was smart, it was strategic, and it was totally adapted to the region. Down in the Deep South, a newly arrived African might try to escape to Spanish Florida. But up in the Chesapeake, someone who knew white culture could use that knowledge to just melt into a city and pretend to be free.
And this wasn't some big secret. The people in power, they saw it. They felt it. I mean, listen to this. One colonial governor actually warned of a dangerous spirit of liberty that he saw simmering just below the surface. He knew something was brewing.
And that spirit didn't just stay a spirit. It erupted into open, armed rebellion. You see it in New York City in 1712. You hear about uprisings in the West Indies that inspired people on the mainland. And then, the big one. In Jamaica, the Maroons, who were escaped slaves, literally fought a war and won their freedom. That sent a message. Rebellion could work.
All of this built up and finally came to a head in the single largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies. We're talking about the Stono Rebellion.
So picture this. A group of slaves in South Carolina gets their hands on guns and ammunition. They start marching south, heading for freedom in Spanish Florida. They're beating drums, calling more people to join them, shouting liberty as they go. They fought until they were finally cornered and overwhelmed by the colonial militia. The rebellion itself was bloody. More than 20 white colonists were killed. But the retaliation? Well, the numbers tell the brutal story. You can see it right here. An estimated 200 enslaved people were killed in the aftermath. You might think a rebellion like this would lead to change or some kind of reform. No. The exact opposite happened. It created sheer terror among the white population. South Carolina's government cracked down hard, tightening the slave laws, controlling every part of black life, and even taxing new slave imports to try and slow things down.
And fear? Well, fear spreads like wildfire. Just 2 years after Stono, in 1741, a wave of pure panic and hysteria exploded in New York City. It was all fueled by rumors of a supposed slave plot to burn the entire city to the ground.
And this panic wasn't just talk. It had real, deadly consequences. By the time the hysteria finally died down, 34 people had been executed for this alleged conspiracy. That includes 4 white people, by the way.
We throw the word freedom around a lot, right? But what if I told you that to the American founders it was this really messy, conflicted idea? To understand the America they built, we have to ask, what did liberty actually mean to them way back before 1776? Let's dig in. So, to get to the bottom of this, we've got to rewind. Before all the revolutionary fervor, what did an American colonist even mean when they talked about liberty? Well, the answer starts with the empire they were a part of, Great Britain.
You see, in the 1700s, Britain had this incredible self-image. They called themselves an empire of freedom. And this wasn't just some catchy slogan for a poster. No, they genuinely believed they were the freest, most advanced people on the entire planet. It was absolutely central to who they thought they were.
And for them, liberty wasn't this vague philosophical thing. Oh no, it was real. It was tangible. It was a system built on some pretty solid pillars. You had a powerful parliament, you had the common law, this idea of Protestantism being tied to freedom, and of course sacred rights like trial by jury. But the big one, the real kicker, was the idea that their government only had power because they, the people, consented to it.
And man, were they proud of it. This wasn't just a casual belief. It was a core part of their identity. They looked around at the rest of the world, at France, at Spain, and saw tyranny, what they called popery, and, well, barbarism. Liberty was their thing. It was what made them British. It was what made them better.
So, sounds pretty great, doesn't it? A whole empire built on the idea of freedom. But, and this is a huge but, we have to ask the really tough question. Freedom for whom?
Because when you peel back the layers, the reality is pretty ugly. This celebrated British freedom had some massive glaring blind spots. For one, it was totally okay with huge gaps in rights between the rich and the poor. It didn't stop the Royal Navy from literally kidnapping sailors off the street, a practice they called impressment, and forcing them to serve. And here's the biggest contradiction of all. This empire of freedom was also a massive slave empire, built on the backs of enslaved people.
So, with all this as the backdrop, as tensions started to bubble up between Britain and the colonies, two really powerful but also rival ideas about liberty started to take hold in America. They both came from Britain, and they were both about pushing back against power, but they had fundamentally different answers to the question, what does it mean to be free?
All right, let's break down the first one. It's called republicanism. And right off the bat, forget about modern political parties. That's not what this is. This is a whole worldview, and it's all about the public good, the community.
So for a Republican, freedom wasn't something you just had. It was something you did. It was about actively participating in public life, getting involved, serving the community. But, and here's the catch, not everyone got to do this. It was really only for citizens who are economically independent.
So why was that? Why the focus on economic independence? Well, it all came down to property. For these thinkers, owning land was everything. It meant you weren't beholden to anyone. No boss, no landlord, no wealthy patron. You were your own man. And only then, only when you were truly independent, could you have what they called virtue. That's the key word. Virtue meant being able to set aside your own selfish interests for the good of the whole community.
Okay, so that's one side of the coin. Now let's flip it over and look at the other major idea, which took a totally different approach. This philosophy, called liberalism, wasn't so much about the community. It was all about protecting the individual.
This idea comes largely from the English philosopher John Locke. And for him, and for liberals, liberty wasn't about what you owed the public. It was about what the government couldn't do to you. The whole point was to protect your private life, your individual freedoms. Think of it like building a wall around yourself, and the government is not allowed to cross it.
And the foundation for this is an idea called the social contract. It's pretty simple, really. The thinking goes like this. We, the people, agree to give up a little bit of our freedom to create a government, but we only do that for one specific reason. For that government to protect our natural rights. You know the ones, life, liberty, and property. And if the government ever fails to do that, if it breaks the contract, well then the people have the right, even the duty, to overthrow it.
Okay, so we've got these two big ideas floating around. Republicanism, which is all about public virtue and the community, and liberalism, which is all about individual rights in your private life. They seem almost opposite, right? So how on earth did these two competing visions of freedom end up fueling the same revolution?
Well, here's the fascinating part. Despite all their differences, they overlapped on one absolutely crucial point: property. For the Republicans, owning property was the key to being an independent, virtuous citizen. For the liberals, property was a fundamental natural right that the government had to protect at all costs. This shared obsession with property, that was the common ground. That was the bedrock that the entire revolutionary movement was built on.
And this is what you could call the Great American Synthesis. The colonists didn't just pick one and discard the other. No, they mixed them together. They took the Republican focus on public good and virtue, and they combined it with the liberal passion for individual rights and limiting government. The result was this incredibly powerful ideological cocktail, one that was perfectly designed to justify a revolution against a king.
But here's the thing. Buried inside this new American idea of liberty, there was a kind of time bomb, and it was planted there by John Locke. See, he didn't argue that these rights were just for English people. He said they were natural rights. And natural means universal, for everyone. And that one little idea, well, it would have some truly explosive consequences.
Now, let's be real. In their day-to-day lives, when the founders talked about a free individual, they were pretty much thinking of a white guy who owned property. That was the reality. But the language they used, this powerful idea of universal natural rights, you couldn't put that back in the box. It opened a door, because if liberty is a right you're born with, then why doesn't it apply to the poor, to women, to enslaved people? They could now take the founders' own words and use them to demand their own freedom.
And that brings us to the big, unresolved question that the American Revolution unleashed on the world, a question we are still grappling with today. Once you say that liberty is a natural right for everyone, who gets to draw the line? Who gets to decide who's in the circle of freedom and who's left on the outside?
Okay, so let's jump right in. We often think of the American Revolution as this big bang that just happened in 1776. But the truth is, for decades before that, the colonies were building a political and intellectual culture that was just radically different from Great Britain. And we're going to explore exactly how that happened.
Just look at these numbers. It's kind of mind-blowing, right? Back in Britain, the property rules were so strict that less than 5% of men could even vote. But in the American colonies, land was everywhere. So you had this situation where a whopping 50 to 80% of adult white men had the right to vote. They were basically living in two completely different political universes.
So that brings up a really fascinating question, doesn't it? If so many people could vote, way more than in the mother country, does that mean the colonies were the true democracies we sometimes imagine them to be? Well, as we're about to find out, the answer is a lot more complicated than that.
All right, first up, let's take a look at who was actually holding the reins of power, because this reveals a pretty deep contradiction right at the heart of colonial life.
And here is that paradox in black and white. On one side, you've got this amazingly broad group of voters, especially for that time. But then you look at the other side and you realize huge chunks of the population were just completely shut out. Women, poor folks, people who rented land, Native Americans, and pretty soon almost all African Americans. They had no political voice whatsoever.
And check this out. This really shows the massive gap between just voting and actually having power. In South Carolina, yeah, you could vote if you had 50 acres of land. But if you wanted to run for office, you needed 10 times that amount of land, plus 10 slaves. This pretty much guaranteed that only the super wealthy elite could even think about governing.
So you see, this wasn't just a coincidence. It was a system. Political power was locked up tight within a small circle of rich, well-connected families. They passed that influence down from one generation to the next. You basically had a kind of colonial aristocracy.
So, you might be wondering, how did this cozy little system start to fall apart? Well, let's look at how the elected colonial assemblies began to wrestle power away from the British governors who were supposed to be calling all the shots.
Now, you've got to understand the backdrop for all of this. It was a British policy called salutary neglect, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Britain was so tangled up with wars and problems in Europe that it basically just left the American colonies alone to run themselves. This created a power vacuum, and the local assemblies were more than ready to step in and fill it.
And they had the perfect lever to do it. The dynamic was simple, but wow, was it effective. The governors, who were appointed by the king, needed money for their own salaries, for public projects, you name it. But the colonial assemblies, the guys who were elected by the people, controlled all the taxes. So they'd say, sure, we'll approve your funds, but in exchange, we want more power. This was famously known as the power of the purse.
And you could see this happening everywhere. In Pennsylvania, the assembly got so strong it just eliminated the governor's advisory council. Boom, gone. In Massachusetts, they kept the royal officials on a very short leash by refusing to give them permanent salaries. Over time, these assemblies started to see themselves as the real defenders of the people's rights against the power of the king.
Okay, so the circle of political influence is about to get a whole lot wider. Debate wasn't just stuck in fancy government halls anymore. It started spilling out into the streets, into taverns, into newspapers. A whole new public sphere was being born.
The 18th century was the era of the club. You had places like coffeehouses where regular citizens would get together and debate everything under the sun. Science, philosophy, and yeah, especially politics.
And hey, it wasn't just for the high-minded intellectuals. In ordinary taverns, people from every walk of life, merchants, farmers, craftsmen, were all starting to talk about public issues with this new sense of freedom and importance. And what was driving all of this? The printing press, of course. Literacy rates were surprisingly high. I mean, get this. 3/4 of free men could read. So there was this huge appetite for newspapers, pamphlets, and books. Libraries started popping up, and political commentary became a must-read in the local paper.
But, and this is a huge but, criticizing the government was a super risky move. The whole idea of freedom of the press that we take for granted today, it just didn't exist. You could be thrown in jail for seditious libel if you printed anything negative about an official, even if it was true.
So all this tension kind of came to a head in 1735 with the trial of a New York printer named John Peter Zenger. He'd criticized the governor and he was in big trouble. But his lawyer, Andrew Hamilton, made this incredible argument to the jury. He said, look, this isn't just about some poor printer. This is about the cause of liberty for everyone.
His point was revolutionary. He argued that printing the truth, no matter how much it stings the government, can't be a crime. The jury walks out to deliberate. And really, the future of free expression in America is in their hands.
And the verdict comes back, not guilty. This was a bombshell. It was this huge victory that sent a shockwave through the colonies. It was a clear message. Citizens had a right to hold their government accountable. The press was starting to find its teeth.
So what's the intellectual fuel for this fire, right? Well, there was a massive philosophical revolution sweeping through Europe and America, and it was teaching people to question everything, including the very idea of who should have authority.
This was the Enlightenment, and at its core, it was this really powerful idea that we should use reason and science, not just tradition or faith, to figure out how society should work. It was all about thinking for yourself.
And this was a huge, huge shift in how people thought about the world. The old way was all about inherited power, the divine right of kings, and just accepting things because that's how they'd always been. The Enlightenment flipped that on its head. It celebrated natural laws, individual rights, and the power of reason and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Philosophers like John Locke were arguing that our beliefs should be based on actual evidence. This led to ideas like deism. Deists believed that God was sort of like a master watchmaker who created the universe, wound it up with perfect natural laws, and then kind of stepped back to let it run. For them, studying science and nature was a much better way to honor the creator than just sitting in a church pew.
So, you put it all together, a surprisingly large number of voters, powerful local assemblies flexing their muscles, a booming public conversation in taverns and newspapers, and this Enlightenment ideal that championed reason above all else. You've created a political culture that's just primed and ready to question authority. It really set the stage for everything that was to come. Which leaves us with one final big question to think about. If reason is your guide, who gets to decide what's reasonable?
The Great Awakening, a massive religious revival that did way more than just pack the pews. It actually helped light the fuse for the American Revolution. Okay, let's get into it. So right off the bat, here's the big question we're tackling today. How in the world did a bunch of church revivals end up sparking a political revolution? I mean, it sounds like a stretch, right? But believe me, the connection is there, and it's super powerful. Let's break it down. All right, first up, Section 1, a fading faith. To really get why this revival happened, we have to travel back to the early 18th century in colonial America. You see, a lot of religious leaders were getting worried. They looked at their congregations and thought, uh-oh, people's faith is seriously fizzling out. Now, don't get me wrong, religion was a huge part of life back then. I mean, it was often the law, funded by taxes and everything, but for a lot of ministers, something just felt empty. Going to church was becoming more of a chore, a formal duty instead of a passionate personal experience. The fire just wasn't there anymore. And you can see why they were worried. You had all these things happening at once. People were pushing west, moving farther away from established towns and their churches. At the same time, commerce was booming and folks were getting more focused on making money. And then you have the Enlightenment sweeping in with all these new ideas about reason and science that made some people question old school faith. It was basically the perfect storm for a spiritual decline. So what do you do when faith is fading? Well, a new generation of preachers had an answer, and it wasn't quiet or formal, it was loud, it was emotional, and it was electrifying. This was preaching with fire. And that's exactly what the Great Awakening was. It's really important to get this. It wasn't some big, organized movement planned from the top down. Nope. It was more like a series of spiritual explosions, intense local revivals that just caught on and spread like wildfire from one colony to the next. And at the center of all this were these incredibly charismatic preachers who had two totally different styles. You had Jonathan Edwards, a guy who basically scared people into being religious by talking about God's anger and the horrors of hell. Then, on the other hand, you had George Whitefield, who came along with this message of mercy and hope, telling people that salvation was available to absolutely everyone. And if you want to know what I mean by scary, just listen to this line from Edwards' most famous sermon. He told the congregation that God holds them over the pit of hell like you'd hold a spider over a fire. Yikes. It was absolutely terrifying, but man, did it get people's attention. But the real celebrity, the rock star of the Great Awakening, was George Whitefield. This guy was an absolute phenomenon. His preaching was filled with emotion and drama. He traveled all over the colonies, and people would come out in the thousands, packing into open fields just to hear him speak. He made religion feel alive and personal. Okay, so as you can probably guess, not everybody was a fan of this new, loud, emotional style of worship. In fact, it created a huge rift in colonial society, a great divide, you could say, between the old, traditional church and these new, fiery revivalists. The old guard, the established ministers, they were not happy. They complained that these new preachers didn't have the right education, that they were just stirring up trouble and messing with the established order of things. It got so heated that some colonies, like Connecticut, actually started passing laws to punish these traveling preachers. And the result of all this conflict? The whole religious landscape just kind of shattered. The Great Awakening didn't just bring people back to church, it split churches apart. The old Congregationalist church broke into different factions. Meanwhile, groups that really embraced the revival, we're talking Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, their numbers just exploded. So now you have all these new churches popping up, and that leads to a brand new and pretty radical idea. People started saying, hey, wait a minute, why am I paying taxes to support an official church that I don't even go to anymore? For the first time, a lot of ordinary people were arguing that your faith should be your choice, and the government should have nothing to do with it. And that brings us to our last section, and really the heart of the matter, this independent spirit. Because the Great Awakening didn't just change churches, it changed how people saw the world, and, more importantly, how they saw themselves. This new movement really spoke to everyday people, especially the poor. The revivalist preachers often criticized the rich and powerful, saying they cared more about money than God. And this message even started to chip away at the institution of slavery. Some preachers called it a sin, while others pushed slave owners to see their enslaved workers as spiritual equals, which led to a wave of conversions and even some owners freeing their slaves. So, let's connect the dots. How do we get from salvation to revolution? Well, think of it like this. Step 1, the awakening teaches regular people that it's okay to question authority, in this case, their ministers. Step 2, it tells them to trust their own judgment, their own personal experience with God. And step 3, well, once you get comfortable questioning the authority of the guy in the pulpit, it's not a big leap to start questioning the authority of the wealthy elites, the colonial governors, maybe even the King of England. And that, right there, is the most important legacy of all of this. If you boil it all down, the Great Awakening taught an entire generation of regular American colonists to trust themselves, to believe that their own views, their own conscience, mattered more than what some distant, powerful elite told them to think.
You know, when we think about America before the Revolution, our minds almost always go straight to the 13 British colonies, right? But that's really just one piece of a much bigger, much more complicated puzzle. So today, we're going to look beyond that familiar story to the other great powers that were shaping North America.
It's a great question. Who was really in charge here? The answer, well, it isn't nearly as simple as a map with a few neat lines drawn on it. Sure, Britain was building an absolute powerhouse on the East Coast, but two other European giants, Spain and France, had claims to enormous territories. But as we're about to see, claiming land and actually controlling it are two very, very different things.
So, let's kick things off with Spain. I mean, on paper, their empire was just colossal. It stretched all the way from Florida, across the Gulf Coast, and clear over to California. But the thing is, this empire was stretched incredibly thin. It was huge, but it was also surprisingly fragile.
And to really get why Spain was so vulnerable, you have to see just how different their whole approach was from the British. The Spanish model was all about these big urban centers, like Mexico City, but with very few actual Spanish settlers spreading out across the land. Their whole colonial economy really depended on native labor. The British, though, they were all about farming and packing in as many settlers as possible, and that difference in population density, well, it would turn out to be absolutely crucial. This Spanish way of doing things created some really serious problems for them. First off, they weren't dealing with empty land, not even close. Powerful native nations, especially the Comanche and the Apache, controlled massive chunks of the territory that Spain had claimed on their maps. Add to that a constant lack of settlers, endless debates back in Spain about how to even run the colonies, and a king who couldn't spare many resources, and you've got a recipe for a very shaky empire.
And this brings us to a super important point. The Comanches weren't just resisting the Spanish. In many parts of the Southwest, they were the dominant power. They basically created a barrier, a frontier that Spain simply could not cross. They were the ones who dictated the terms of trade, of war, and of settlement. It just goes to show you that European control was far from a done deal.
Okay, so to see Spain's strategy and its weaknesses in action, let's zoom in on one specific region where they made this last-ditch effort to plant their flag for good, California. And this wasn't about a flood of colonists looking for a new life. No, this was a cold, calculated geopolitical move.
So what kicks this whole thing off? In a word, fear. Spain starts seeing Russian fur traders building forts and pushing south from Alaska, and they basically panic. Their reaction is to launch what they call the Sacred Experiment, a plan to build a chain of missions all along the California coast to lock down their claim. But right off the bat, they hit a huge problem. A native uprising closes their only land route from Mexico. This leaves the brand new California colony totally isolated and incredibly vulnerable.
And the man whose job it was to make this whole fragile experiment work was Father Junipero Serra. He was the absolute driving force behind the California mission system, and his legacy today is, to put it mildly, deeply controversial.
I mean, his legacy is just a complete study in contrasts. On the one hand, the Catholic Church literally made him a saint. He's praised for converting thousands of native people to Christianity and for bringing European-style agriculture to the region. But then, on the other hand, that entire system was built on forced labor. It used corporal punishment, like whipping, on people who tried to escape, and it unintentionally spread devastating European diseases that just ripped through native communities.
And the results were absolutely catastrophic. The native population in California just plummeted, and it was this devastating mix of factors. New diseases, which they had zero immunity to, were the #1 killer. But the brutal system of forced labor and the massive environmental changes from Spanish livestock and farming also took an incredible toll.
Okay, so while Spain was struggling with its huge, underpopulated lands in the south and west, Britain was facing a totally different kind of rival up north, France.
Now, the key thing to understand about the French Empire is that they were not trying to fill up North America with French people. Theirs was an empire built as a web of forts, trading posts, and, this is the most important part, alliances with Native American nations. It was all about commerce and strategic influence, not settlement.
France's holdings in North America were anchored by two gigantic river systems, the St. Lawrence, up in Canada, and the Mississippi, down in Louisiana. From these two hubs, they projected their power, not with waves of settlers, but with a super complex network of alliances with native nations built around the incredibly profitable fur trade. This was a commercial and military empire, not a demographic one. In fact, the French crown actually discouraged people from moving there, seeing North America less as a new home and more as a strategic asset, or, a convenient place to exile people.
And that last point brings us to what is probably the single most important factor in this entire imperial contest. Because in the end, wars and empires, they often come down to simple math. So let's just look at the numbers.
By the mid-1700s, this was the rough population of the British colonies in North America. 1.5 million people. Just let that number sink in for a second.
And this was the grand total of French colonists in all of North America, from Canada all the way down to Louisiana. 65,000. I mean, the difference is just staggering.
So when you put it all together like this, the picture becomes crystal clear. Despite France's smart alliances and Spain's massive land claims, they were both just demographically overwhelmed. The British colonies were like a tidal wave of people that the other empires simply could not compete with. This huge population advantage, that was ultimately the decisive factor in the struggle for the continent.
The 7 Years' War isn't just some prequel, it's the event that lit the fuse for 1776. And that leads us to this incredible central puzzle that we're going to unpack. It's a fantastic paradox, isn't it? How did Britain's single greatest imperial victory, a war they fought to make their American colonies safe, end up being the very thing that caused them to lose those colonies? The answer, well, it changes how you see the entire American Revolution. So to find that answer, we've got to start right here, in the Ohio Valley. Back in the mid-1700s, this was not some empty frontier. Oh no, it was this really complex and tense place caught in a three-way power struggle between the British, the French, and a very powerful network of Native American tribes. This whole area was known as the Middle Ground, and you should think of it less like a simple border and more like a really tense diplomatic dance floor. No single group, not the French, not the British, not the tribes, had absolute control. It was all about shifting alliances and just trying to coexist. And right here, you can see the fundamental problem perfectly. On one side, you have the American colonists, especially the rich and powerful ones, dreaming of building a new empire out west. It was all about land, land, land. But on the other side, the Native American strategy was the complete opposite. Stay independent by masterfully playing the British and the French against each other, making sure neither side got too powerful. So get this, the spark that lit up a global war didn't come from some palace in Europe. Nope, it started right here in the colonies. A group called the Ohio Company, full of Virginia's most powerful men, got a grant for 500,000 acres and basically told the French, this is ours now. That aggressive move, that was the spark. And with that one little spark, this regional fight just exploded. It went global. This was the war that was going to cement Britain's place as a world superpower. The only problem? The victory was going to come at a staggering cost. A cost that would, ironically, kickstart a revolution. And, the war did not start well for the British at all. A young, ambitious George Washington was sent to take on the French, and he was forced to surrender. For the first 2 years, things looked really grim. Indian raids were so effective, they were actually pushing the line of colonial settlement back east. The tide only turned in 1757 when Britain just decided to throw an unbelievable amount of money and resources into the fight. And wow, did that investment pay off? I mean, big time. Britain didn't just win in America, they won everywhere. They crushed the French Navy, they grabbed their super profitable sugar islands in the Caribbean, they kicked French settlers out of Nova Scotia, who, by the way, would become the Cajuns in Louisiana, and they even took control of India. The French global empire was just shattered. The result of all this was a completely transformed world. The peace treaty they signed in Paris in 1763 redrew the map of North America, and in doing so, it created a whole new set of massive problems. Just look at this incredible swap of territories. Britain gets all of Canada, Florida, huge chunks of land. Spain gets Louisiana from France. But here's the real headline. France is basically gone from mainland North America. Just poof. Britain now stands alone, looking like the undisputed champion. But a victory like that, it does not come cheap. Britain's national debt had ballooned to £133 million, an absolutely crushing, unthinkable amount of money back then. And to pay it all back, the government in London started looking for new money, and their eyes turned directly to those American colonies they had just saved. And this is where the whole story takes a hard turn, because Britain's victory didn't actually solve problems. It created new ones, seemingly unsolvable ones. The very success of the war ended up sowing the seeds of the next, bigger conflict. First off, with the French out of the picture, the Native American tribes lost all their leverage. They couldn't play one empire against the other anymore. So, facing the threat of unstoppable British expansion, a powerful new idea started to spread, a pan-Indian identity. Prophets like Neolin began preaching that all tribes needed to see themselves as one people, to unite and drive the Europeans out. And that idea of unity, it wasn't just talk. It exploded into Pontiac's Rebellion, where a confederation of tribes attacked British forts all across the frontier. Now, to avoid another incredibly expensive war, the British government just drew a line in the sand, the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding any settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. And just like that, the colonists, who thought they had just fought and bled for that exact land, were absolutely furious. And the colonists weren't just mad. They basically said, yeah, no thanks. They just ignored it. This quote from George Washington says it all. He's basically telling his friends to go get that western land anyway, convinced it was a temporary rule. The defiance, you see, it had already begun. And this brings us to the biggest irony of this whole thing. Right at the end of the war, the American colonists had never been more proud to be British. They had fought shoulder to shoulder with British troops to defeat their common enemy. But the reality was that the consequences of that victory, that massive debt, the new taxes coming their way, and that hated proclamation line were creating these deep, permanent cracks in their relationship with Britain.